Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In this episode of our Stories from Maine podcast comes a sad tale and a truly shameful event. Located just off the coast of Phippsburg, Maine, lies a small island with a regrettable history. On June 10 of 1911, the death of 82-year-old Abby W. Perry began a snowball effect, which resulted in one of the most disturbing and shameful state-sanctioned actions in Maine's illustrious history. Join us for the story of Malaga Island, next on Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine podcast for the third week of January 2025. The book series, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, are authored by Maine historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books are available from all booksellers and through Amazon. And you can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. You can also read our all-new Stories from Maine articles in each weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times-Record. Look for our weekly stories online, or pick up your copy of the Times-Record on newsstands each Friday.
This Week in Maine history takes us back to January 19 of 1929, when the United States National Park Service changes the name of Lafayette National Park, located on Maine's Mount Desert Island, to Acadia National Park. The park was made a public land preserve in 1916, and was originally named the Sieur de Monts National Monument. The land trust was given national park status in 1919, as Lafayette National Park, to honor the Marquis de Lafayette, a French aristocrat and military commander who led American troops during several battles of the American Revolution. Today, Acadia National Park is one of the most beautiful jewels in the crown of America's national park system, and one of the greatest of Maine's natural wonders. Now, let's head over to Oscar for this week's story of Malaga Island.
On June 10 of 1911, the death of 82-year-old Abby W. Perry began a snowball effect, which resulted in one of the most disturbing and shameful state-sanctioned racist actions in Maine history. For nearly 30 years, Abby had been the sole owner of a tiny 41-acre island located just off the shore of Phippsburg, Maine. Abby had inherited the land from her father, Elijah Clifford, after he died in 1882. Now, with Abby's death, her heirs inherited the island, and they wanted to sell it off, split the cash, and pocket the money. But there was one major problem. The island was inhabited. In about 1859, Henry Griffin and his wife Fatima had settled on Malaga Island. There, Henry and Fatima raised a family. As time evolved, more people came to the island and settled. The island soon became a community of black families and white families, who all lived together in harmony and shared their work from the sea for their daily bread. Many of the marriages of these Malagaites were made up of interracial couples, who were still not wholly socially accepted elsewhere. Interracial marriage had been illegal in Maine when Malaga Island was first settled, but Maine's anti-miscegenation law was eventually repealed by 1883. Yet, the interracial marriages were still frowned upon by state and local officials, as well as many of the people of Maine. Abby had known there were many living on her island, just as her father had known while he owned it. Neither Abby nor her father minded the small but growing population of more than 30 people. Yet, word of these poor mixed-race inhabitants had spread all along the mid-coast, and a growing group of upset citizens began to spread false and ugly rumors aimed directly at the Malaga Island residents. In reality, the community was doing well, and the people of the island had not been a problem. Suddenly, these Malagaites were seen as a predicament, and one that had to be dealt with. Much discussion and innuendo was targeting these mixed-race people and attacking the way in which they lived. Now these poor and ill-educated people were being labeled as criminals, immoral heathens, and were cast as a queer and feeble-minded group. Missionaries had gone to the small island in about 1905 and tried to improve the Malaga community, and they attempted to quell the misery that was spreading. These missionaries built a schoolhouse and began educating the children of Malaga. These missionaries also brought medicine, food, clothing, and religion to the island's inhabitants. With the work of the missionaries, the community was now doing quite well, and many of the concerns so many had voiced had now been addressed and corrected. Yet, the venom of false rumors and name-calling only increased, and the racial intolerance against these Malagaites only grew more bitter. Local articles in Maine newspapers soon began printing commentaries against the islanders, and local officials were now poking around to investigate. Calls for the removal of these biracial Malagaites from the island had becoming aggressive and serious. But, without the consent of the island's owner, nothing more could be done to rid the coastal areas of this supposed menace. However, there were some claims that the people of Malaga Island might have actually, in truth, owned the land. The rumor stated that one man, Henry Griffin, had originally purchased the land from a Perry relative through a bond-to-deed sale many years before. Yet, arguments were made that no other Perry relative had any rights to sell the island. The whole matter of true ownership of Malaga Island would have to be clearly decided, and thus the state of Maine stepped in to settle the claim.
Oscar will return in just a moment with more of our story.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of our Stories from Maine weekly podcast. Please tune in each Saturday as we explore more legendary tales and true stories from the history of the Pine Tree State. And you can hear our podcast on both YouTube and Spotify. So, please subscribe and follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. You can also email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com.
In our next This Week in Maine History, we look back on January 28 of 1768, when Moses Little and Jonathan Bagley, both from Newbury, Massachusetts, receive a grant from the Pejepscot proprietors for lands around the Androscoggin River Falls. One of the conditions of this colonization requires that 50 families come to live on these lands in 50 separate houses by June 1 of 1774. By the fall of 1770, Paul Hildreth becomes the first settler to move there. Today, this settlement, named Lewiston, would eventually become the second largest city in the Pine Tree State. Now, let's get back to Oscar and more of our story of Malaga Island.
By July of 1911, just 1 month after Abby's death, Maine Governor Frederick Plaisted visited Malaga Island and officially condemned the small island. A newspaper article quoted Governor Plaisted as saying that conditions are not credible to our state and that we ought not to have such things near our front door. Then, as soon as Plaisted left Malaga Island, he immediately joined the anti-Malaga movement. Governor Plaisted had already harbored secret intentions of his own, as he wanted to increase Maine's tourism on the mid-coast, and he wanted to see an increase in property values on the rocky coast of Maine. Plaisted believed the Malaga Island residents were an ugly and distasteful blight that kept tourists away and prevented property values from rising. Plaisted's own governor's executive council undertook the issue of ownership, and this council quickly determined that the island was solely owned by the Perry heirs. With the help of Maine's Attorney General, William Pattingall, Plaisted quickly made his case. Plaisted's executive council further determined that the people of Malaga Island were incapable of caring for themselves, despite that they had already done so for nearly 75 years. The council also decided that these people were dependent on state aid and thus were wards of the state. The governor's executive council was then granted lawful authority over these wards. It is believed that the missionaries, led by Captain George Lane and his wife Lucy, generously tried to purchase the island in order to allow the Malagaites to remain. But the captain was immediately overruled and denied the opportunity to help these island people. Instead, the state of Maine purchased Malaga Island from the Perry heirs for a scant $471. Moreover, one of the members of the governor's executive council, a medical man named Dr. Gustavus C. Kilgore, signed papers committing 8 of the island's inhabitants to the state's hospital for the feeble-minded, now known as Pineland. Then, the governor ordered the immediate eviction of the residents from Malaga Island. Now, just 1 year after Abby Perry had passed away, the entire community of Malaga Island were ordered by the county sheriff to abandon the island and leave by July 1st of 1912. Many within the anti-Malaga movement, as well as the government officials, had thought the eviction would be a major problem. But when officials showed up on July 1st to forcefully remove any remaining residents, they discovered that the island was completely vacated. Everyone who had lived on the island had left, rather than face forced eviction. Rumors of just how aggressive the eviction would be, coupled with the knowledge that 8 of their own had already been committed to a mental hospital, motivated these once peaceful and prosperous residents of Malaga Island to flee for their lives. These once proud people even dismantled their own shack-like homes and carted most of it all off as well. Nearly 50 Malagaites then scattered on the winds, many finding other places to live within Maine, and some leaving the Pine Tree State forever. However, there were some residents still on the island who could not leave on their own, and state officials made sure they were swiftly removed as well. 17 individuals, whose remains were interred in the Malaga Island Cemetery, were dug up and carted away, only to be reinterred in the cemetery at the Hospital for the Feeble-Minded at Pineland.
Oscar will return in just a moment with more of our story.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of our Stories from Maine weekly podcast. Please tune in each Saturday as we explore more legendary tales and true stories from the history of the Pine Tree State. And you can hear our podcast on both YouTube and Spotify. So, please subscribe and follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. You can also email us at storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. You can also read our all-new Stories from Maine articles in each weekend edition of the Brunswick, Maine newspaper, The Times Record. Look for our weekly stories online, or pick up your copy of the Times Record on newsstands each Friday.
For our next This Week in Maine History. On January 21st of 1833, Ezekiel Holmes publishes the first issue of a newspaper in Winthrop, Maine, that will come to be known as the Maine Farmer. Often called the father of Maine agriculture, Holmes also helps to establish the University of Maine as an agricultural school at Orono. Then, Holmes goes on to serve 2 terms in the Maine House of Representatives and 2 terms in the Maine State Senate, before going back to the Maine House of Representatives for another 2 terms. Holmes would die in 1865 at Winthrop, Maine. Now, let's go back to Oscar for the conclusion of our feature story.
By December of 1912, the state of Maine sold Malaga Island to the winning bidder of a sealed auction. The winner, Everard Wilson, then paid $1,650, or just a little over $40 per acre. It is interesting to note that Wilson, the new owner of the island, was a close friend of Dr. Kilgore. In the end, the unjust and racially motivated eviction of the Malaga Island people netted the state of Maine a profit of $1,179. Now, the Malaga matter, the overreaching and disturbing actions of the state, and the cruel and bigoted displacement of these Malaga people from Malaga Island seem to be over. And today, We know this dark period in American history to be associated with the bigoted and terrible eugenics movement of the early 20th century. In April of 2010, the Malaga incident had once again become a headline in Maine's newspapers, and the Maine state legislature had reviewed the Malaga Island displacement, and they issued an official statement of regret that the incident had ever occurred. Governor John Baldacci also issued his own statement of regret, all coming nearly 98 years after the forced displacement of innocent islanders was ordered by his predecessor. Today, the Maine Coast Heritage Trust has labored to honor the people of Malaga Island and continue to tell their sad and regrettable story. The island is now a historic preserve that is a part of the Maine Freedom Trail, where tourism and visitors are welcome. The legend of the Malaga Island Displacement, a stain on the history of the Pine Tree State, now stands as one of the more dastardly and regrettable of our stories from Maine.
Please join us again next week for another incredible episode from Maine's history on our Stories from Maine podcast. See you then.
Lori Suzanne Dell's books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through all book retailers and through Amazon. Stay up to date with us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify. All content of the Stories from Maine podcast are copyrighted and may not be reproduced in any way without the express written permission of author and historian Lori Suzanne Dell. You can contact Stories from Maine by sending an email to storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. Thank you.